This is living history. This is history that still reverberates to this day. We are not talking about colonial times. My name is David Grann. I'm the author of Killers of the Flower Moon, and today I'm going to be watching a few clips for the movie, directed by Martin Scorsese, which was an adaptation from the book, and talking a little bit more about the story behind the story.
You've asked for additional monies of $752 to pay a medical bill for an abscess.
When the Osage had gotten incredibly wealthy because of oil deposits under their land, the U.S. government began to hold these hearings in Congress debating what are we going to do with the Osage with all their money. And they went so far as to pass this legislation requiring many Osage to have these white guardians to manage their fortunes.
Now, Molly, it's your mother. You know, she's restricted too, so we have to account for every penny.
And this system was not abstractly racist, it was literally racist. It was based on the quantum of Osage blood. So if you were a half-blooded or a full-blooded Osage, you were suddenly deemed incompetent, or as you saw in the clip, restricted. And suddenly you had this guardian telling you whether you could buy that toothpaste or that car. It was ridiculous. And not only was it a racist system, it also ushered in a large state and federally sanctioned criminal enterprise as many of the guardians began to swindle and embezzle millions and millions of dollars from the Osage.
It says here she spent $319.05 for meat at the grocery.
They discuss in that scene Mollie Burkhart's mother's spending on meat, and that is taken directly from a file and a record in which that complaint existed, where the guardians were complaining about what meat, Lizzie had.
Don't you think that's an awful lot of meat for what she needs?
Yes, Mr. Beatty.
Lily Gladstone, who's playing Mollie, to some level it's self-protection. You see her nodding. But what's so powerful in that scene is you can see and tell that she thinks the system at its core is completely rotten and unjust. Interestingly enough, I found a record from the 1930s, shortly before Mollie died, of natural causes, and it was her appealing her incompetency to the court. And she was finally deemed competent, and only then was she granted control over what remained of her pilfered and stolen fortune. Only then was she granted the full-fledged rights of an American citizen.
When this money started coming, we should have known it came with something else, because it's a white man's money. Yeah. It's not what we were taught coming down Missouri.
Every time I watch that scene, I'm almost rattled. To me, it's one of the most powerful scenes in the film, and such a credit to Scorsese and the actors and the production team. Many of those people in that tribal council I've known over the years. Many of them were not actors beforehand. There's Yancey Redcorn, there's Everett, you hear them both talking. And these are members of the Osage Nation who lost relatives, in many cases, during the Osage Reign of Terror when these murders were taking place.
They're like buzzards circling our people.
Yeah.
Gonna pick us body clean, leave nothing.
Much of what they say there, and at least as I've been told, some of it is improvised. Much of it is what they are channeling, that anger, the things that they have heard, that they grew up hearing from their grandparents and parents, and is brought into that scene is so raw and so real. And it's a reminder that this is living history. This is history that still reverberates to this day. We are not talking about colonial times.
All of our elders have come through this landscape, and only thing we know is that we have each other.
When I interview many of the Osage elders during the course of research for my book, I always got the sense they realized that so many other people outside the Osage Nation were unaware of this history. And even though I never asked them exactly why they were willing to share with me these stories and open to sharing, I think that was always why, that there was a sense that it was important for people across the country, even in Oklahoma, to know this history, to begin to reckon with this history, because for too long it had been erased.
I close my heart and keep what is good there. But hate comes, and I say I ought to kill these white men who killed my family.
Mrs. Burkhart, Bill Burns, I solve crimes.
Many of those Osage, including Mollie Burkhart, really valiantly crusaded for justice, even though they were putting a bullseye on their own back. I mean, Mollie was going to local law enforcement, demanding investigations, offering to give testimony, issuing money for rewards, hiring private detectives, as were other Osage. And yet, these crimes were rarely properly looked into because of widespread prejudice, because the victims were Native Americans, and also because of widespread corruption. It was very easy back then for the powerful to tilt the scales of justice with payoffs. Each element for years of investigation failed. The private detectives were often corrupt. They seemed to be covering up the evidence rather than exposing it. Local lawmen were ignoring the crimes or seemed to be possibly even complicit in them. And there was great danger to the few who did try to investigate. One man was thrown off a speeding train because it looked like he was getting closer to the possible killers and suspects.
Resolution 23, Mr. McBride will travel to Washington, D.C. to meet with the Indian Affairs Commission, where he will ask for private investigators and additional police so that they can look into this matter of all this death.
At one point, the Osage had asked somebody to go to Washington, D.C. to see if he could get federal authorities to investigate. He checked into a boarding house. He carried with him a Bible and a pistol. He received a telegram from Oklahoma that said, "Be careful." That evening, he left the boarding house. He was abducted, and his body was found in a culvert the next day, and he'd been stabbed and beaten to death. The Washington Post later carried a headline that declared what the Osage had long already known. It said, "Conspiracy to kill rich American Indians." After the official death toll climbed to more than 24, the Osage Tribal Council, as you saw in that scene, issued a proclamation demanding that federal authorities finally step in. And it was then when the case was taken up by a rather obscure branch of the Justice Department. It was then known as the Bureau of Investigation. Later it would become known as the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or the FBI. But even their investigation was enormously bungled for 2 years. The Bureau was plagued by many of the same problems that plagued law enforcement across the country back then: poor training of officers, possibly corruption, prejudice. At one point during the Bureau investigation, they had even gotten a local outlaw, a guy named Blackie Thompson, out of jail, and they hoped to use him as an undercover informant. And instead, he slipped away, he robbed a bank, and he killed a police officer. And J. Edgar Hoover, the new director, was so frightened that the scandal might cost him his job. And eventually, he pulls in another investigator, a man named Tom White, to take over the investigation. And at that point, they put together an undercover team, including an American Indian officer, to go in and try to solve some of these cases.
I would like to add $1,000 to that reward money for any information about these murders. That means if anyone knows anything about it, you must come to me.
About the first 2 years of researching this history, I kind of assumed that this was a story about this singular evil figure, William K. Hale, who had committed these crimes with a few henchmen, because that was the theory that was propounded by the FBI and that had kind of been passed down. And as I spoke to many Osage elders, they began to tell me about other murders that were not properly investigated, that they had conducted their own investigations, and these were not part of the official count. And then I began to gather records that suggested there was a much deeper and darker conspiracy that the FBI had never exposed. One day I was out in Fort Worth in Texas, where a branch of the National Archives, and I was doing research on the guardianship system, and I had in a box this little booklet. It looked almost like a ledger that contained the names of guardians and the Osages whose fortunes they had managed over a span of a few years. And I noticed under this guardian, under these 5 Osages who this guardian had managed, I noticed the word dead written next to the first name, dead next to the second name, dead, 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 all 5. And I thought, well, that's crazy. That's kind of mind-boggling. And I began to look more through the booklet, and I noticed was another guardian who had about a dozen Osages whose fortune they had managed and had about a 50% mortality rate. And on it went. Now, no doubt some of these deaths were of natural causes, but it defied any natural death rate. You have to understand, the Osage had money, they were not hungry, they had access to health care. And at least in some of the cases, when I looked into them, I could find trails and traces of evidence suggesting malfeasance, suggesting a poison, suggesting a headright or a share in the oil mineral trust had been stolen, a complaint about a murder. And I began to realize that this little booklet contained the hints of a systematic murder campaign. It was documents like this, interviews with the Osage, that began to demolish the book I thought I was writing. And this became less a book about who did it than who didn't do it. That it was really about a culture of killing. It was about doctors who were administering poisons. It was about morticians who would cover up bullet wounds. It was about lawmen and prosecutors who were on the take, and many others who were complicit in their silence.